I am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to MI Channel Warm Leaves.
The first flakes of snow began to fall on the afternoon of December 20th, settling softly on the frost-hardened lawns of Millbrook Village like a benediction. The entire parish seemed to exhale with relief as the season's final preparations drew to a close. Wreaths adorned every doorway along the high street, and the vicar's wife had outdone herself with the church decorations. Garlands of holly and ivy twisted around the stone pillars, their red berries gleaming like drops of blood against the ancient grey walls. It was precisely the sort of picturesque English village that appeared on Christmas cards, the kind that made outsiders sigh with longing for a simpler time, a gentler world. But Miss Jane Marple, who had lived in St. Mary Mead for the better part of 7 decades and had witnessed every conceivable variation of human cruelty, knew better than to trust in the serenity of appearances. The Ashford Manor Christmas Eve party was an institution in Millbrook, a tradition as reliable as the church bells that rang each Sunday morning. For 30 years, Sir Reginald Ashford and his wife, the formidable Lady Catherine, had opened their doors to the entire village on the evening before Christmas. The guest list was always the same: the vicar and his wife, the doctor and his elderly mother, the schoolmaster and his new bride, several retired couples of indeterminate significance, and a sprinkling of the village's more prominent citizens. This year, however, there was an addition to the usual roster. Miss Marple had received her invitation, written in Lady Catherine's precise hand, specifically requesting her attendance. The note had been brief and formal, yet Miss Marple detected in its measured tone something almost desperate, though she could not quite say why. She had accepted, of course, and now found herself being driven up the long gravel drive toward the imposing Victorian mansion as darkness fell and the first real snow of winter began to accumulate in earnest. The manor was ablaze with lights. Every window glowed warmly, and the front entrance had been decorated with an enormous Christmas tree that must have been at least 15 feet tall, its branches laden with white lights that gave it the appearance of being carved from crystallized moonlight. Servants in crisp uniforms stood ready to take coats and direct guests toward the drawing room, where a fire crackled in the enormous fireplace, and the scent of mulled wine and cinnamon hung in the air like a pleasant memory. Sir Reginald stood near the tree, a glass of sherry in one hand, greeting arrivals with his customary booming voice and expansive gestures. He was a man of 65, still handsome in a faded sort of way, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His wife stood slightly apart, watching the proceedings with cool grey eyes that missed nothing. Lady Catherine was 10 years her husband's junior, but seemed somehow older, her face arranged in an expression of polite interest that betrayed not the slightest hint of genuine pleasure at any of it. Their son, Richard, was present as well, though he appeared far less enthusiastic about the festivities than his father. Richard was 38, unmarried, and had returned to Millbrook only 6 months earlier after what the villagers euphemistically referred to as difficulties in London. The precise nature of these difficulties remained unclear, though Miss Marple, who made it her business to understand such things, had pieced together from various half-whispered conversations that Richard had been dismissed from his position at a prestigious financial firm under circumstances that suggested impropriety of some sort. He stood now near the window, nursing a drink and watching the assembled guests with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Beside him stood his cousin, Margaret Ashford, who was visiting from Scotland for the holiday season. Margaret was 42, a spinster of independent means, with sharp features and sharper wit. She had always been something of an outsider to the Ashford family, and tonight she seemed to be taking considerable pleasure in making sardonic observations about her relatives to anyone foolish enough to listen. The other guests had begun to arrive in earnest as Miss Marple settled herself into a chair near the warmth of the fire. There was Dr. Hammond with his formidable mother, Mrs. Hammond, who was reputed to have opinions on absolutely everything and was disinclined to keep them to herself. There was the vicar, Reverend Whitmore, a gentleman of 60 who seemed perpetually bemused by the behavior of his flock, and his wife, Eleanor, who was considerably younger and had a tendency toward flirtatiousness that Miss Marple found rather amusing. There was also young Thomas Bexley, the schoolmaster, along with his bride Catherine, a pretty but rather vacant-looking girl of 24 who had married Thomas primarily because he represented stability and she had been unable to imagine any alternative future for herself. And there were others, a half-dozen couples and several single individuals, all of whom formed the social backbone of Millbrook's upper middle class. The evening proceeded with the customary rituals of such occasions. Wine was served, canapés were circulated, and conversation flowed along predictable channels: the weather, the state of local affairs, inquiries about absent friends and relatives. Yet beneath the surface pleasantries, Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension. That was more pronounced than usual. She noticed that Sir Reginald seemed unusually tense, his bonhomie appearing slightly strained. She observed that Lady Catherine rarely looked at her husband directly, and when she did, her expression was unreadable but somehow cold. She saw Richard exchange sharp words with his father near the drinks table, though both men immediately resumed their social masks when they realized others were watching. And she noticed that Margaret seemed to be watching her cousin Richard with something akin to predatory interest, a small smile playing at her lips whenever he seemed discomfited. At precisely 9 o'clock, Lady Catherine announced that dinner would be served in the dining room. The guests processed through the hallway, passing beneath a massive chandelier that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and entered the formal dining room where a long table had been set with what Miss Marple recognized as the Ashfords' finest china and silver. The meal progressed through multiple courses with practiced efficiency, the servants appearing and disappearing like ghosts, ensuring that glasses remained filled and plates remained cleared. Miss Marple found herself seated between the vicar and Dr. Hammond, a position that afforded her an excellent view of the table's dynamics. She watched as Sir Reginald drank considerably more wine than was his custom, his face becoming progressively more flushed as the evening advanced. She observed that Richard barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate, while his eyes darted toward his father with an expression that might have been apprehension or anticipation. Miss Marple was not yet certain which, and she noticed that Margaret seemed to be conducting some sort of elaborate performance, laughing perhaps too loudly at jokes that were not particularly funny, and directing pointed comments toward various Millie members in a manner that seemed calculated to provoke discomfort. By the time the dessert course was cleared away and the guests had returned to the drawing room for coffee and digestives, the tension had become almost palpable, though most of the assembled company seemed oblivious to it. The fire had burned lower in the hearth, and the Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights casting strange shadows across the room. Lady Catherine suggested that the ladies retire to the small parlour, while the gentlemen enjoyed cigars and brandy in the library. A suggestion that was met with the usual enthusiasm, or in this case, the usual resigned acceptance. It was just as Miss Marple was rising from her chair, adjusting the folds of her lavender dress, that they heard it, a scream, high-pitched and terrified, emanating from somewhere on the upper floors of the manor. For a moment, no one moved. The scream came again, even more anguished than before. Then there was a sound of running footsteps, and suddenly the drawing-room door flew open to reveal one of the servants, a young maid named Susan, her face white as bone and her eyes wide with something beyond fear, something like ultimate horror. She attempted to speak, but only incoherent sounds emerged from her mouth. Sir Reginald, displaying some presence of mind despite his elevated consumption of alcohol, grasped the girl by the shoulders and demanded to know what was wrong. It took several minutes and several false starts before Susan could communicate her terrible message. There were bodies, she said. Bodies in the upstairs bathroom, and there was blood, so much blood, and oh God, it was Mr. Stephen Fairfax and Miss Diana Ashford, and they were both quite dead. The drawing-room seemed to contract suddenly, as though all the air had been sucked from the space in a single catastrophic instant. For a moment that stretched. Into eternity, no one spoke. Then chaos erupted. Sir Reginald released the maid and moved toward the doorway with the purposefulness of a man accustomed to taking command in moments of crisis, his earlier inebriation seemingly burned away by shock and adrenaline. Lady Catherine remained perfectly still, her face a mask of composure so absolute that it bordered on the inhuman. Dr. Hammond was on his feet immediately, his medical training overriding his social instincts, and he followed Sir Reginald from the room without hesitation. The vicar began murmuring prayers, his lips moving silently as his wife gripped his arm with enough force to leave marks. The other guests erupted into a cacophony of shocked exclamations and urgent whispers, each person immediately consumed with their own reaction to the catastrophe that had descended upon Ashford Manor like a curse. Miss Marple, however, remained seated. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, ensuring that it did not rattle against the saucer, and allowed her knitting needles to fall still in her lap. Her pale blue eyes, which most people assumed were perpetually focused on nothing in particular, had sharpened into an expression of acute observation. She watched the room with the practiced attention of someone who understood that the initial reactions to such a shock often revealed more truth than any subsequent utterance could manage. She noted that Richard Ashford had gone absolutely rigid, his face drained of all color, his hand trembling so violently that he dropped the brandy sniffer he had been holding. It shattered on the carpet with a sound like a gunshot, but he seemed not to notice. She observed that Margaret had risen to her feet and was moving toward the door with the determination of someone who had no intention of being excluded from the unfolding drama. She saw that young Thomas Bexley was gripping his bride's hand so tightly that Catherine let out a small whimper of pain, though whether this was genuine discomfort or merely an expression of her general distress was unclear. And she watched Lady Catherine, who had not moved an inch, whose expression had not altered by so much as a millimetre, though her right hand had clenched into such a tight fist that her knuckles had turned white beneath her skin. Within 10 minutes Sir Reginald returned, and his face told the assembled company that the maid's account had been entirely accurate. His voice, when he spoke, was thick and strained, barely recognizable as his own. Stephen Fairfax and Diana Ashford were indeed dead. They were in the upstairs bathroom, the one adjoining the guest bedrooms, and they had apparently been there for some time. There was no doubt whatsoever that they were beyond any assistance that Dr. Hammond might have rendered. Sir Reginald's delivery was choppy and incomplete, as though his mind was struggling to process the information even as his mouth formed the words. It was left to someone else in the room to ask the question that everyone was thinking: who were Stephen Fairfax and Diana Ashford, and what had they been doing in the guest bathroom at Ashford Manor? The answer to this question produced a second shockwave, nearly as profound as the first. Stephen Fairfax was the young man who worked as an assistant to the solicitor in the neighbouring town of Ashbrook. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and was known to frequent Millbrook on social occasions, though he possessed no particular connections to the village, beyond a casual acquaintance with several of its younger residents. Diana Ashford, however, was Sir Reginald's niece, his brother's daughter, who had been visiting the manor for the past 2 weeks. She was 22 years old, pretty in a conventional sort of way, and had been staying as a guest in the manor while her parents were abroad on an extended holiday in the south of France. The fact that these two young people had been found together in a bathroom, both deceased, suggested implications so scandalous that even the most gossipy members of the village could scarcely articulate them aloud. It was at this precise moment, while the room was still reeling from the shock of this revelation, that the local police arrived. The telephone had been rung in the moments following the discovery. Miss Marple was not certain precisely by whom, though she suspected it had been Dr. Hammond, and the constabulary had wasted no time in responding to such a grave emergency. Inspector Blackwood was the senior officer, a man of 55 with a methodical manner and the air of someone who had seen enough of human depravity to be unsurprised by almost anything. He was accompanied by 2 junior constables and a police surgeon, Dr. Fletcher, who immediately ascended the stairs to examine the bodies, while the inspector began the preliminary work of securing the scene and preventing contamination of the evidence. Inspector Blackwood established himself in the library and began the process of interviewing the guests, one by one. The procedure was time-consuming and thorough, though Miss Marple observed that his line of questioning, while competent enough, lacked the psychological subtlety that would be required to uncover the true nature of what had occurred. He asked where people had been at the time of the discovery, whether anyone had heard or seen anything unusual, whether anyone could provide information about the relationship between Stephen Fairfax and Diana Ashford. Most of the guests responded with the predictable mixture of shock, distress, and carefully constructed narratives designed to place themselves at as great a distance as possible from the body. And their discovery. Only Richard Ashford seemed to struggle with his responses, and only Lady Catherine maintained that peculiar mask of absolute composure. By the time the police had finished their preliminary interviews, it was nearly 2 a.m. Inspector Blackwood announced that the bodies would need to be removed to the mortuary and that Dr. Fletcher would conduct a thorough post-mortem examination. He indicated that the guests would be permitted to leave the manor, though he requested that everyone provide their address and confirm their availability for further questioning. The news was greeted with visible relief by most of those assembled, though Sir Reginald seemed reluctant to allow the police to remove his niece's body, and he required some gentle but firm persuasion from the inspector before he accepted the inevitable. As the guests began to depart, Miss Marple made her way toward the hallway, where coats and cloaks had been collected by the servants hours earlier. She moved slowly, deliberately, allowing the other guests to file past her. She observed that Richard Ashford's hands were still trembling as he struggled into his overcoat. She noticed that Margaret was speaking in low, urgent tones with Dr. Hammond, though both parties fell silent immediately when they realized they were being observed. She saw that Lady Catherine had withdrawn to a corner of the entrance hall, her eyes distant, her expression suggesting that she was engaged in some form of internal struggle known only to herself. As Miss Marple waited for the village car to be brought round to collect her, she reflected on what she had witnessed during the evening. She thought about the tension that had existed between Sir Reginald and his son, about the strange intensity with which Margaret had observed her family members, about the peculiar immunity to shock that Lady Catherine seemed to possess. She thought about a young man and a young woman, now dead under the Christmas tree that stood in the corner of the drawing-room, its lights still twinkling with their cheerful, oblivious radiance. And she thought about the terrible truth that she had begun, in the smallest and most preliminary way, to suspect. Nothing about this tragedy, she was increasingly certain, was quite as simple or straightforward as it appeared. The murderer, for murderer there certainly was, walked among the people of Millbrook, and they would require all of her observational skill and understanding of human nature to be exposed. Miss Marple settled into the car with a quiet sigh and prepared for what she knew would be a very long investigation indeed. The morning following the murders dawned grey and bitter, with fresh snow falling in thick, deliberate flakes that seemed determined to bury the world beneath a blanket of absolute whiteness. Miss Marple, who had slept poorly and fitfully, rose at her customary hour of 6 o'clock and prepared herself a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, which she consumed while seated in her small, comfortable sitting-room. The wireless in the corner delivered the morning news, though the announcer made no mention of the catastrophe that had befallen Ashford Manor. Such local tragedies, Miss Marple reflected, rarely penetrated the broader consciousness of the nation until they had achieved a certain notoriety, and it was perhaps only a matter of time before the newspapers seized upon this one with the hungry enthusiasm they typically reserved for scandals involving the upper classes and sudden death. By mid-morning, she had received a visit from her young friend, Lucy Cartwright, who served as the secretary to the editor of the Millbrook Gazette, and was therefore positioned to gather information with a rapidity that would have put profs. Chenal detectives to shame. Lucy was breathless with the weight of what she had learned, and she practically collapsed into the chair across from Miss Marple, with an expression suggesting that she bore news of tremendous significance. According to Lucy, who had heard this from the constable's wife, who had heard it from her husband, Dr. Fletcher had concluded that both Diana Ashford and Stephen Fairfax had been poisoned. The toxicology results were not yet complete, but the symptoms evident on their bodies, the discoloration of the lips, the peculiar rigidity of the jaw, the foam that had been present around their mouths, all suggested that they had ingested some form of cyanide compound, most likely potassium cyanide, which was readily available in various commercial preparations. The method of death was therefore not, as might have been imagined given their location in a bathroom, an accident, or an act of joint suicide pact. Instead, it was deliberate poisoning, administered to both victims simultaneously or in rapid succession. This conclusion raised questions far more complex than any that had been contemplated the previous evening. Someone at Ashford Manor had possessed access to a lethal poison. Someone had possessed the knowledge of how to administer it effectively. And someone had possessed the motive. Not merely one motive, but multiple motives, layered and intertwined in ways that were not yet apparent. Miss Marple thanked Lucy for this information and assured her that she would be discreet about her knowledge, though they both understood that discretion in matters of murder was somewhat theoretical in a village the size of Millbrook. Over the course of the following day, the village became a hive of speculation and gossip. The facts, such as they were, circulated with impressive speed and impressive mutability. By afternoon, at least 3 different theories, H.E., emerged regarding the identities of the murderers, for it was by now widely accepted that a single individual could not possibly have committed such a heinous crime without assistance. One theory held that Stephen Fairfax and Diana Ashford had been engaged in an illicit affair, and that a jealous rival, variously identified as either Richard Ashford or young Thomas Bexley, had administered the poison in a fit of passionate rage. Another theory suggested that Stephen Fairfax had been involved in some form of financial impropriety, and that Diana Ashford had been killed merely to eliminate a witness or because she had threatened to expose his crimes. A third theory proposed that the murders were part of some elaborate scheme to alter the terms of Sir Reginald's will, thereby benefiting certain family members at the expense of others. Miss Marple listened to these theories with polite attention and said nothing, which was her customary approach to village speculation. However, she had begun, in her own methodical fashion, to conduct her own investigation into the matter. On the afternoon of the second day following the murders, she walked to Ashford Manor, ostensibly to pay her respects to Sir Reginald and Lady Catherine, though her true purpose was somewhat more investigative in nature. The manor was in a state of considerable disorder. Servants went about their duties with subdued efficiency, speaking only when necessary and maintaining expressions of appropriate solemnity. Sir Reginald received her in his study, and Miss Marple was shocked by the transformation that had occurred in his appearance and demeanor over the course of merely 2 days. He seemed to have aged a decade. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from weeping or lack of sleep or both, and his hands trembled noticeably as he gestured for her to sit. During the course of their conversation, Miss RPLL made several observations that she found most interesting. Sir Reginald spoke extensively about Diana, his niece, and his affection for her was genuine and profound. However, when the conversation turned to Stephen Fairfax, his tone became markedly different. He expressed surprise that Diana had apparently been acquainted with the young solicitor's assistant, suggested that he had not been aware of any particular friendship between them, and seemed troubled by the implications that such a friendship might carry. Miss Marple inquired gently whether he had been aware of any romantic attachments that Diana might have formed during her stay at the manor. Sir Reginald's response was immediate and emphatic. No, he had been entirely unaware of any such attachment, and had Diana been engaged in a clandestine romance, he would certainly have expected her mother to inform him of such a thing, given the impropriety that such a situation might entail. When Miss Marple departed from the study, she asked whether she might pay her respects to Lady Catherine. She was informed that Lady Catherine was currently resting in her room and was not receiving visitors. Miss Marple accepted this information with equanimity, though she observed that the servant who conveyed this message seemed somewhat uncomfortable with the lie, for a lie it most certainly was. She had glimpsed Lady Catherine through a window as she had walked through the manor's hallway, standing motionless in the winter garden, staring out at the snow with an expression of such profound desolation that Miss Marple was moved by a moment of genuine pity. Whatever had occurred on Christmas Eve, whatever secrets had been buried beneath the cheerful lights of the Christmas tree, Lady Catherine was suffering considerably as a result of it. As Miss Marple made her way back through the village toward her own home, she called Upo, the vicar's wife, Eleanor Whitmore, ostensibly to inquire about the arrangements for Diana's funeral. Eleanor received her with the enthusiasm that characterized her approach to any social interaction, and she was eager to share such information as she possessed. During their conversation, Miss Marple learned that Stephen Fairfax had attended several social gatherings in Millbrook over the past year, and that he had seemingly formed a particular attachment to Diana, though this attachment had not been widely known. Eleanor mentioned, with obvious relish, that she had observed the two young people in conversation at the village summer fete several months prior, and that they had seemed to be enjoying each other's company in a manner that suggested more than mere acquaintance. Eleanor further mentioned that Richard Ashford had seemed rather put out by this friendship, though she could not say precisely why. When Miss Marple asked whether Richard Ashford had been aware of Diana and Stephen's attachment, Eleanor's response was most illuminating. She stated that she could not be entirely certain, though she had noticed that Richard seemed to go out of his way to be disagreeable whenever Stephen visited the village. She had attributed this to Richard's general bad temper and disposition toward rudeness, but it was possible, Eleanor conceded, that there was something more to it than that. Miss Marple thanked Eleanor for this information and prepared to depart, though she paused at the door to ask one final question. Had Eleanor observed any particular tension or difficulty between Sir Reginald and Richard in recent months? Eleanor's response was immediate and affirmative. Yes, she said, there had been considerable tension between father and son, though the precise nature of their disagreement remained unclear to her. She had heard from various sources that there had been discussions regarding Richard's future and his position within the family business, discussions that had apparently not progressed entirely to Richard's satisfaction. As Miss Marple walked home through the snow, her mind was beginning to construct a framework, still preliminary and tentative, but nonetheless beginning to take shape. A young man and a young woman, connected by some form of romantic attachment, a family in turmoil, with tensions between father and son that ran deeper than ordinary generational conflict. A woman, Lady Catherine, who seemed to be harboring some terrible knowledge or terrible guilt, and a mystery that had been deliberately constructed, Miss Marple suspected, to appear more complex than it was, when in fact, once one understood the true emotional landscape that surrounded the victims, the solution might become considerably clearer. She had not yet identified the murderer with certainty, but she was beginning to understand the motive. And in cases of murder, understanding the motive was often the crucial first step toward understanding everything else. Inspector Blackwood's investigation proceeded with methodical competence over the following days, though Miss Marple observed that his conclusions were being shaped by assumptions rather than evidence, a common failing in men of his profession. The inspector